The Filmic Pro camera app is designed to work around the 180-degree rule. And the rule is one of the steps you need to take to give your video the film look. But the rule is often misunderstood and can lead us to add unnecessary restrictions when we're filming. So let's go through the 180-degree rule, where it comes from, and why we don't always need to observe it exactly. There's two 180-degree rules in filmmaking. One is to do with camera placement and crossing the line. This applies generally when you're filming two people having a conversation. The other 180-degree rule is to do with shutter speed, and the rule goes that your shutter speed should be double the number of your frame rate. So, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, your shutter speed should be 48, or rather 1/48th of a second. Simple. Well, if we're being correct with our maths here, the 48 number is actually half of the 24 number because we're dealing with fractions, like this. 24 FPS is 24 frames per second. Therefore, each frame lasts 1/24th of a second. A second of movie time is divided into 24 parts, and each part being a frame. When we set our shutter to 1/48, it means the shutter is open for 1/48th of a second, so that's exactly half the time the frame is in position. The problem is that some of us started to believe the shutter speed should always be double the frame rate, no matter how fast the frame rate. And this is really a misunderstanding of the 180-degree rule. To truly understand the 180-degree rule, we need to know where it comes from. Why does this rule refer to 180 degrees when it's all about fractions of a second shutter speed? While in film cameras, where actual strips of film are fed through a mechanical device, the shutter is a piece of spinning metal. And this spinning metal has a hole which can be adjusted in size. The size of the hole is determined by the angle of the shutter. So imagine you have a film camera and you have it set to 24 frames per second. And this metal shutter will now spin at 24 revolutions per second as well. But how long the frame is exposed depends on how big that hole is, or rather what angle it's set to. If it's set to 90 degrees, the shutter is open for about 1/96th of a second, half as long as 1/48th of a second. And if the shutter is set to 180 degrees, it's open half the time and closed half the time. Or it's open for 1/48th of a second. So this 24 frames per second and 1/48th of a second shutter speed was found to be the best compromise sometime during the 1920s, when things were being kind of worked out. At the time, one of the inventors of movie cameras, Thomas Edison, was pushing for 46 frames per second. As he said, anything else would strain the eye. Well, he was wrong on that, although 46 frames per second would have looked smoother. Thing is, it just wasn't practical. Shooting at 46 frames per second would have used up almost double the movie stock, and therefore double the cost of processing the stock. As well, shooting film stock at 46 frames per second would have reduced the possible exposure time of each frame, meaning filmmakers would need more light on set, and then each movie reel delivered to the cinemas would have to have been double the size, or double the number, and so on. And this would have added a prohibitive cost to movie production. Not only that, but movie cameras were limited by physics. Moving this rather fragile plastic strip of celluloid through a movie camera at 24 frames per second was already enough of a challenge. Remember, the film has to be moved the exact distance each time and then stopped so it doesn't move at all for 1/48th of a second, then moved on so the next frame is in place, and so on. And this has to happen 24 times a second. Going at 46 frames per second would have meant more frequent mechanical breakdowns, and cameras would have been less reliable. And all this is to illustrate where the 180-degree rule comes from. So then, why are we told to set our shutter speed at 1/48th of a second? Or double the frame rate, or half the frame rate, depending on how you look at it? Well, there's only one reason really. And that reason is something known as motion blur. The digital cameras in our smartphones do not have physical shutters spinning around. There's no shutter in your smartphone. Instead, shutter speed simply refers to the length of time the digital sensor behind the lens is switched on per frame. Remember, each frame is a still photograph. Movement in your video or film is an illusion created by playing one still image after another. So when the sensor is switched on, it is receiving light information for one still digital image. When it is switched off, the screen is black. No light is received. And when the video or film is played back, again it is switching on and off at a rate defined by the frame rate. In other words, it's flashing light on and off at 24 times a second. At that speed, our brains join the dots and we only see movement. We don't notice the light of the screen flashing on and off. When you have your shutter speed set to 1/48th of a second, the shutter is open just long enough that movement in the frame will cause blur. Anyone who has taken a still photo will have experienced this blur, quite often ruining our photos. Although motion blur in photos can transform the photo into stunning art, if used well. But in film or video, this motion blur helps to smooth the illusion of movement, as each still frame flicks to the next. But if we're shooting at 24 frames per second and we start to reduce the shutter speed from 1/48th of a second, the video we produce begins to look a bit harsher on the eye. The movement feels less smooth. 100 years ago, filmmakers found a 180-degree shutter to be a good balance. They could create cameras that were reliable, didn't shoot too much film, and when it was projected up on the screen, it looked pretty smooth. But if they could have shot at 60 frames per second and projected at 60 frames per second as easily as we can with our smartphones, they probably would have shot 60 frames per second. So it's important to understand that this motion blur created by a shutter speed double, or actually half, your frame rate is only relevant around the 24 or 25 frames per second, because it's directly related to this compromise of having your still images flashing on and off 24 times a second. But once you move above this rate, even to 30 frames per second, the need to maintain this 180-degree shutter speed becomes less. And that's because the more frames per second you project on the screen, the smoother the motion looks anyway. And another thing to remember is, this rule is only a guide. What's the difference between 1/48th of a second shutter speed and 1/50th of a second? Not much. In fact, I challenge you to shoot at 1/48th of a second and 1/50th of a second and see if you can spot any difference at all. For that reason, it's perfectly fine to set your frame rate at 24 frames per second and your shutter speed at 1/50th. You will get almost exactly the same effect as if it was 1/48th. And this is important because if you want to avoid flickering artificial light in Europe and in other areas, you need to set your shutter to multiples of 25. In Filmic Pro, when you set your frame rate, all you need to do is scroll down to this setting where it says Auto Shutter. Now set this to 50 Hz if you are in an area where the electricity is supplied at 50 Hz. Some will tell you the 180-degree rule should be applied no matter the frame rate. So even at 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second, 240 frames per second, they maintain that you should set your shutter speed to double. But this is really a misunderstanding of the rule. Regular old movie cameras shooting at 24 frames per second certainly could not shoot at 240 frames per second, which would mean film whizzing through the mechanism at 10 times the speed. To shoot at such high frame rates using film stock actually requires a specialist camera designed specifically for the task. Take this as an example. The Arriflex 35-3C 35mm film camera, released in 1982, had a maximum frame rate of 50 frames per second. Remember that this rule comes from the compromise of shooting at 24 frames per second, which looks smooth but is still flashing light on and off 24 times a second. A 180-degree shutter was needed to maintain a sense of natural smoothness. But once you move above this 24 frames per second, there's less of a gap between each still image, so motion begins to look smoother regardless of the shutter speed. Now, if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, for example, you do not need to set your shutter speed to 1/120th of a second. In fact, 1/60th of a second will be completely fine, or even 1/100th of a second. What about if you want to shoot at 60 frames per second and play back at 24 frames per second to create slow motion? What shutter speed should you use then? Well, it's actually impossible to shoot at 1/48th of a second, and setting your shutter speed to 1/60th would look fine. So, to sum up, the 180-degree rule should be taken as a rough guide. But really, the important thing is to understand what the shutter speed does to the look of your video. So rather than slavishly applying the 180-degree rule to every shot, experiment and learn how shutter speed and frame rate work together to create a feeling and a style in the shot. No one way of doing it is right or wrong, because it depends what you want to do with the shot. For example, when filming action sports, filmmakers often use high shutter speeds to create more of a gritty style, and that high shutter speed look creates a different type of energy in the shot. It becomes more visceral, more impactful, and that's why we need to understand the effect of shutter speed and the 180-degree rule, because then we will become creative filmmakers.